Sup, bros. My name is Terry, and I'm a bull. And today I will be talking about that article that I talked about in Conversations We Can't Have. If you haven't seen my last video on intersectionality, you don't have to see it to understand this, but you might like it anyway. It's just an overview of what intersectionality is. I chose this article because it simultaneously points out all of intersectionality's faults while still saying that it should still be used. In my first video, when I mentioned it, I'd only read the first paragraph and thought that she was just saying that society just wasn't ready for intersectionality yet, and to an extent I was right, but there is much more to it than that. Much more, bros. So much more that I am actually going to make this into more than one video. It will probably be a two-parter, and one of them will be a bit longer than the other because despite there being an even amount of sections, there are some of the sections within this article are longer than others. Before I go any further, I would like to say that I'm linking this article in the description to cite my source. And if any of you bros decide to go over and read the entire thing and investigate the other links for yourself to see if to form your own opinion on it, feel free to do so. I encourage that, bros. But if you decide to comment, please be respectful. Please. Just be respectful. Don't try and antagonize or say, Terry Bowl sent you here or whatever. No, I'm not sending anyone. The only reason I'm sending anyone anywhere is so that they can form their own opinion on this and not just go by what I have to say, because you might get a totally different impression of it than I do. And in fact, if you do, bros, let me know. I'm always open for discussion. I love discussion. I wouldn't have started this if I didn't. Well, anyway, part one of the Conversations We Can't Have, Social Capital and Violence in Radical Communities. This article is written by Emmy Bevensey, and from what I can tell by browsing her blog, she is an anarcho-communist and also a feminist. I'm not sure if she's specifically an anarcho-feminist or not, because I genuinely do not really know the nuances of the various different anarcho-factions out there. But she does argue for intersectionality, which leads me to believe that she is in fact an anarcho-feminist. I might be wrong though, and if Emmy, you're listening to this video, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about that, or clarify your point. There are conversations that radicals are trying to have and also desperately avoiding. Conversations that push the edges of our frameworks into and past their limits, often with victims along the path. The problem is that we have created a somewhat rigid identity politic framework that, while succeeding in creating a message that is clear enough to reach a broad and mainstream audience, is also so inflexible that it wreaks havoc on the situations that fall outside of its scope or threaten its integrity with their liminality. Liminality, bros, is a term from anthropology that refers to the state of beginning an initiation, say from boyhood to manhood or whatever, and being in the state where you're not quite at the end of the final product of that initiation process, but somewhere in between. For the purposes of this, she's using it to mean ambiguity. Intersectionality has tried to address the complexity of our experience, but much of the more radical implications have not yet caught on. In many situations, we try to reach beyond where the discourse currently is without doing the necessary preliminary work of building the trust and nuance needed to parse complexity. She's basically saying that society as a whole is not ready for the entire message because they don't trust them yet. The society doesn't trust the radical communities yet. To make these conversations even more difficult, people build social capital or social power around themselves along many often conflicting dynamics of intersectional privilege and marginalization. This social capital weaves into intersectional power dynamics that make certain needed conversations difficult or taboo. Basically, the concept of social capital kind of locks intersectionality up and not work as intended. From this initial reading of this first paragraph, I hope you bros can understand why I thought that she was merely just hand-waving it and saying that society wasn't ready, because honestly, she has a point. You cannot have a meaningful dialogue if there is not trust present between the two discussing parties, which is why here at Tau Sigma we have the motto of trust, respect, and sanity. So I am going to give kudos to the fact that she is acknowledging that there has to be a mutual trust between for understanding to actually happen. Consent and power. Perfect consent is impossible in any dynamic where there are differentials of power, which is to say, literally every single interaction we have. Remember, bro, she is an anarchist, and so any sort of difference in power is going to be construed as bad. But she is basically saying, because of these differentials in power, there is no such thing as consent in any sort of interaction. Even if someone says yes, they are not actually fully consenting because of metaphysical reason XYZ. We struggle as best we can to level the playing field and make our agreements meaningful. We wrestle with the limited ways we use it to communicate deeply subjective states and experiences across chasms of difference. To pull a TLDR here, I think she is basically saying people be complex, yo. It's true, we cannot understand as different people unless we can literally step into someone else's mind. We cannot fully understand another person. But I genuinely do not think that this is a bad thing or leads to power differentials. We can only process so much information before our systems get overloaded and bogged down. These constraints, coupled with the coercion inherent in having power over another being, make consent an asymptotic process in which we can really only ever try accountable when it breaks down. In this sentence, she basically repeats herself in the same sentence, much like I just did. You see, the term asymptotic is a mathematic principle that describes a line and a curve that are both approaching infinity, where the curve can never ever quite meet the line. Of course, this is actually only true with vertical asymptotes, because there are instances with horizontal asymptotes where, in fact, the curve can, in fact, cross the line, and it also depends on the type of curve. But now that I've totally shredded that metaphor to pieces, she actually defines it within the same sentence and kind of makes the metaphor redundant to begin with. Consent is mediated by power differentials along structural, informal, societal, physical, intellectual, and other forces in clearly discernible ways. Please note this phrase right here, bros. This is an important phrase that I will be constantly referring back to throughout this analysis. Consent is mediated by power differentials along structural, informal, social, physical, and intellectual, and other forces in clearly discernible ways. Focus on the clearly discernible ways, bros. For a grotesque example, prepare yourself, bros, for this grotesque example. If someone has power over one's potential career trajectory, there is an incentive to feign consent to that person's wishes, even if they don't explicitly leverage it in any way. The power is embedded even if it's never spoken. So basically, when you're a kid and your mom says that if you do your chores, you'll get your allowance, you're just feigning consent to the thing because you really don't want to do the chores to earn the allowance. You're just feigning consent, and this is grotesque. Or for a more grown-up example, you're working and you have a boss, and this boss pretty much lets you do whatever you want. They leave you alone because you're a good worker, and you know that they have the power to increase or dock your pay or give you a promotion. You know exactly what you need to do to earn this promotion or the pay raise, and what you need to not do to avoid docking pay. But you also know that your boss is a pretty chill bro, so if you make mistakes every once in a while, they're not going to dock your pay for it. But what she's saying is that the fact that your boss has power over you, this is forcing you to feign consent because deep down you really don't want to do that work anyway. Because giving in to someone else's will is a form of oppression based on this. This example is illustrative of the way that power interacts with all of our interactions and agreements, extending to more subtle and also non-sexual contexts as well. Intersectionality as dynamic and contextual. Suffering is not easily calculated, yet we, on the broad left, tend to keep a rough tally of someone's oppressed identities in our head in order to form rough sensitivity calculations. This is mostly not a bad thing. It's a necessary thing. But it's a process with stark limits that, if we apply too rigidly, can create errors with painful implications. The problem is that the power does not strictly follow the patterns we have come to recognize within it. Power exists in many different levels that interact constantly and dynamically. The levels at which power interacts are nested, but not with strict uniformity. So basically, this power does not, in fact, work in clearly discernible ways. That's basically what she is saying here. The subjective impacts the interpersonal, all of which are interacting with each other, and the micro and macro forces at play in a big mess of waveforms. Once again, not easily discernible, those big messes of waveforms. These different levels can contradict each other if they are seen in strict silos rather than as information flows in open systems. This metaphor is brought to you by computer programming and thermodynamics. To go into the explanations of those terms because that would require another video entirely, but she will thankfully totally make those metaphors redundant in the next sentence with her example. For example, a person can be oppressed structurally but enact certain forms of informal social power in radical spaces that overcompensate for the real obstacle that person faces. Power and domination can be both general and contextual. What she is describing but not actually saying here is patriarchy theory or systemic oppression or systemic racism or internalized misogyny or whatever have you. This is the entire thing of there's a system of oppression in place, but if you play into that system of oppression's games, you can actually gain status and do well, but while everyone else around you is still oppressed. She did not need to relate that to thermodynamics and a convoluted computer science metaphor. She could have just said that there is constantly flowing information, and sometimes this information doesn't work in the... She's basically saying that things that things are not a closed system and where things are just static and will eventually just kind of break down. No, things are new information is constantly being fed in, and we have to act on it, is basically what she's saying here. By now, many of us have interacted with a situation where a person who may be oppressed structurally, but has used the oppression to justify or obscure their violence against a more structurally privileged person, or someone of roughly their same level. I have to give kudos to her here because this is one of the few times I have actually seen someone on the far left actually acknowledge that this happens. Because you see this all the time with, I'll give an example later, but basically, a simple example would be an Antifa protester hitting Richard Spencer because they perceived him as a Nazi. This is because there's a certain type of social capital or social power that one can sometimes leverage in radical spaces due to the difficulties and delicacies inherent in calling that person out if they are oppressed in other ways. Basically playing the oppression Olympics. This is tricky, of course, because in the instance of, say, a trans person assaulting a cis person, or a person of color abusing a white person, there are no doubt structural influences and traumas that take part and led to these incidences, and certainly color the way we seek to enact or minimize accountability. Basically, it's bad that they decided to use violence, but that person basically had it coming because of the other structural influences and traumas. We know that in, for example, bringing to light the instance of an oppressed person calling out an excessively violent matter, we risk privileged discourses manipulating this instance to undermine the ways in which other oppressed people struggle to assert their boundaries in the face of massive socio-political resistance. Say, for example, bros, let's take, say, a Muslim person who decided to try and, sneak knives into the Louvre. And when they're caught, and in the process of the struggle injure a French soldier, and then get shot in critical condition, this will be used by those critical of Islam to say, look how bad Islam is. It is basically what she's describing, is that situation where the other side will take advantage of a radical situation to work their narrative around it. Although, I have to say, she does talk about analyzing accountability, and she does go into more detail in that later in the article, and I have to give her kudos for that, bros. Because not many people, more SJW, are willing to talk about these issues. And I think ultimately this is what she's trying to do with this article, is hold that kind of a community accountable. She's talking to radical communities, but everything she says can be applied to the greater social paradigm, really, bros. But I'm going to cut this off here, and I will get the other video, which will be a bit longer than this one, up sometime soon. But this is just a basic introduction. I will summarize the entire article in more simple terms at the very end of the next part of this, and I will also I'll try and put a button in that one to skip to that if you don't want to go through the entire article, because it is a very long and verbose article, and although I do believe it is a fascinating read. But anyway, bros, that's it for this part. Keep an eye out for the next part. And if you like what you've seen so far, please like, subscribe, find Twitter. I'm Terry Bull. I'm also on Gab. So shoot me some messages. I'm always looking for people to talk to and more things to talk about. So if you have anything you want me to talk about, let me know, bros. Peace, love, Taurus.